UT Southwestern School of Medicine in Dallas, and teach a class every other fall usually. And then I teach continuing education classes from time to time, including the classes that either psychologists or psychiatrists have to take to be court appointed to conduct both competency to stand trial evaluations and insanity evaluations.
So that course is mandatory?
If you want to be court appointed to do those things, yes.
And then have you testified at the request of the prosecution and the defense?
I have.
And pretty much what's the split there regarding prosecution versus defense?
Well, I've kept track of this since 1997, and since that time I have testified at the request of the prosecution or the state approximately 60% of the time, and approximately 34% of the time at the request of the defense, and then the other 7% was at the request of the judge.
And what types of cases have you testified for in those situations? What type of offenses?
Well, all types. More that are serious, more that are crimes against person, and the most cases that I've testified in have been cases of murder or capital murder.
And have you testified in other states as an expert or in forensic psychology?
I have.
What other states?
Testified in New Mexico, Kansas, Colorado, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Florida.
And have you ever been retained by the defense and issued an opinion regarding not guilty by reason of insanity?
I have.
And on few or many occasions?
On few occasions.
And then have you been retained by the state and issued an opinion regarding not guilty by reason of insanity?
I have.
On few or many occasions?
A few occasions where I was retained by the state and issued an opinion of not guilty by reason of insanity.
And how many times approximately have you testified regarding insanity?
About 25 times, that's an estimate, with the first time being in 1987.
And is not guilty by reason of insanity a common defense, or is it rare?
It is not common. It is rare as a defense.
And then what is not guilty by reason of insanity? What does that mean?
Well, in Texas, each state can be a little different, but in Texas it means that it's an affirmative defense to prosecution that at the time of the conduct charged, the actor, as a result of a severe mental disease or defect, did not know his conduct was wrong.
And that's at the time of the offense, correct?
Correct.
And I would assume, doctor, that most of the time you aren't there at the time of the offense.
Most of the time I'm not there at the time of the offense, yes.
Okay, so what do you look for?
Well, there's always records, especially the more serious a case is, the more there is in terms of a police file. If there is a severe mental disease or defect, there's typically psychiatric treatment either prior to the offense or afterwards, and of course they keep a lot of files on that. You can look to what the person says happened. You can compare that to the police report, the report of, if it's possible, of the victim or people that saw the offense, talked to the defendant at around the time of the offense, and then you also talk to the defendant and ask them, even if it's 2 years afterwards or any other time, ask them what happened, what's their version of the offense.
And the person's presumed to be sane at the time in Texas, is that correct?
Correct.
And once the state proves the offense was committed, it's up to the defense to meet their burden of proof to rebut that and say that and prove that the defendant was insane at the time of the offense. Is that your understanding?
Yes.
Is voluntary intoxication a defense to conduct in the state of Texas?
It is not.
And earlier when you read the definition of insanity, what does wrong mean?
Wrong in the state of Texas by case law means against the law, illegal.
And have you been retained by the state of Texas through me to give an opinion on Kody Lott and whether he was insane at the time of the offense
I have.
of murder and aggravated assault that occurred on September 2nd, 2016?
I have, yes.
And did I try to influence your professional opinion in any way?
No.
And do you have a professional opinion regarding the sanity of the defendant at the time of the offense committed by him on September 2nd of 2016 for the murder of Lauren Mondavazo and the aggravated assault of Michaela Smith?
I do.
And what is that opinion?
My opinion is that at the time of the conduct charged on September 2nd, 2016, Kody Lott was likely suffering from a severe mental disease or defect, but it did not prevent him from knowing that his conduct was wrong.
And I'd ask that the record reflect, did you author a report that gives the basis of your opinion?
I did.
I'd ask that the record reflect that the state has previously tendered a copy of Dr. Price's report prior to his testimony.
That's correct, Mr. President. The record will so reflect.
And Dr. Price, can you identify the person that you conducted an insanity evaluation on? Is he in the courtroom here today?
Yes, he is.
Can you identify him?
Yes, he has a blue shirt on sitting to the left of Mr. Rasmussen.
I'd ask that the record reflect that that the witnesses identified the defendant.
The record will so reflect.
And before we get into your report, you're charging the state of Texas, are you not?
I am.
And what is your fee for your evaluation and your testimony?
The fee is $300 an hour.
And how many hours have you put into this case so far?
Approximately 25, 30 hours.
And that's a similar charge that you charge whether you're for the state or the defense or by the court, is that correct?
It's the same fee, yes.
And would you say that insanity is a pretty high burden for the defense?
Yes, it is, especially in Texas.
And yesterday, or the day before, we talked about or asked questions of the defense expert, and one of the examples was Jeffrey Dahmer.
Yes.
And he had killed and dismembered, I believe, 17 young males
Yes.
in Milwaukee,
Correct.
and he was found to be sane at the time of the offense. Is that correct?
Correct.
Despite the heinous nature of his conduct.
That's correct.
And then more recently, what comes to mind is the Christopher Kyle capital murder, and Mr. Littlefield, I believe, was the other victim, by an Eddie Ralph.
Yes,
Are you familiar with that case?
I am.
And he was found to be sane at the time of the offense by a Texas jury, is that correct?
Correct.
And how are you familiar with that case?
I was an expert in that case and testified at the request of the prosecution.
And what what was your opinion in that case?
Well, it was similar to this one, that the defendant in that case, Eddie Ralph, was suffering, as they say, from a severe mental disease or defect, but in his case, it was substance-induced due to voluntary intoxication, and it did not, even though he was impaired by that at the time, it did not prevent him from knowing that his conduct was wrong.
And with regard to your report, Dr. Price, what are your evaluation procedures?
Well, always the place to start is a review of the records. In an insanity case, those are probably the most important things to look at. What other people saw, what the defendant said and did close to the offense. Like in this case, I mean, we're 2 years out from the offense. So anything around the time of the offense that I can review and analyze for his behavior, what he said at the time, is important. Again, if there are psychiatric treatment records, those are important to review, and excuse me, and I had those in this case. And if there's a statement given by the defendant at the time as to what he did, obviously that's important. And interviews of other people that may have seen or heard something, especially of the defendant at that time, are important, and I had some of those in this case. They did not reveal a lot in this case. Immediately following the incarceration of a defendant and until such time as it comes to trial, there's also frequently correspondence to people, and that in jail is monitored, and also calls that the defendant places are also taken, and those are made available to listen to, and those also can provide information, and those were present in this case. There are also 2 other psychological evaluations conducted of him concerning his competency to stand trial, and then if possible, if allowed, I come to the court to listen to the other expert and to review anything that the other expert produces that outlines what his or her opinions were, are, and what the basis of those is.
Okay, and so you were provided a copy of the Dr. Falls' his notes, correct?
Yes.
And did I ask you to make this report that you made? Or is that something that you regularly do?
I don't remember if you asked or not. I regularly do write a report in every case.
And So you read all the police reports and their supplemental reports, which included interviews of various witnesses that were out there on scene at the time of the offense, correct?
Yes.
And you reviewed the summary of several jail telephone calls and listened to some also,
Yes.
on top of all the mental health records.
Yes.
And in addition to that, were you able to interview the defendant, Kody Lott, at the request of the court?
Yes.
And when did you interview Kody Lott?
August the 15th of 2018.
And where did you interview the defendant?
At the jail in Wichita Falls.
And one part of your examination or observation, you have a number of things that you look for, is that correct?
Yes.
Such as their general appearance and behavior.
Yes.
And how did you find the defendant?
At the time I saw him, his hair was at his shoulders. Overall, his hygiene and grooming were good. And of course, he was attired in jail coveralls.
And what was his mood and affect?
It was his affect, that's immediately the expression of emotions, was somewhat flat. In other words, wasn't showing a lot of emotion, but at times he did show emotion, smiled, laughed, and at the times he did that, it was rather inappropriate because it was when discussing the offense. Similar, maybe not quite as animated as you saw in the video yesterday when discussing the offense, being somewhat excited. He wasn't quite that animated when I saw him, but he did smile and laugh inappropriately at that time. He gave a history of some symptoms of depression since he was incarcerated, and some prior to that as well. He denied any previous experiences with being really active. We call it manic. Except when he was high on drugs. He says that he would get that way with certain drugs. He did say that he had a long history of anxiety, of nervousness, especially as it related to being around other people. He was uncomfortable around others, and so that was part of the history that he gave to me. He did not show any signs of remorse about the offense. So that in general was his emotional status at the time I saw him in August.
And did Mr. Lott tell you that he enjoyed reading about the occult
He did?
and that he flipped through the Bible?
Yes.
And did he report to you any history of hearing voices?
He did report a history of hearing voices at times, yes.
Okay, and were those voices, were they inside of his head or outside of his head?
They were outside his head.
And does that have any significance to you?
Typically, when people are having a psychotic episode where they have what we call auditory hallucinations, those voices, whatever they hear, are inside their head. So that would be inconsistent with what we typically would see with auditory hallucinations.
tell you if he recognized the voices?
He did. He said he did not recognize the voices.
And were those voices male or female?
He said they were both.
And on the day before the offense, did the voices tell him anything?
He told me that the voices on the day before the offense said, "Enjoy murder, and it will be worth it."
And did he tell you if there were any voices on the day of the offense, September 2nd of 2016?
He said he did not hear any voices on that day.
Did he express anything with regard to Satanists?
Yes.
And what did he relate to you regarding Satanists?
Well, he said that he was fascinated with the occult, with Satanism, with the supernatural, and one of the few times that he mentioned anything to me about Satanism around the time of the offense was that he thought he would get some kind of satanic award if he submitted himself to the devil. He further told me that he could relate to Satanists because they use drugs, and as he put it, they were kind of down and out on the outside of the mainstream of society, and he could relate to that.
And did he mention anything with regard to their use or acceptance of drug usage?
Yes, that he said that they that was another part of Satanism that he could relate to. He has, as we know, a pretty extensive history of drug abuse, and he remains interested in that.
And does he have a history of conforming to social norms with respect to lawful behavior, just generally without any specifics?
Generally, he does have somewhat of a history of conforming his behavior to the law, of a lack of conforming his behavior to the law.
And I'm going to jump to whether you performed any tests on the defendant.
Okay,
And ask you if you performed any tests
I did.
and what types of tests.
Well, these are psychological tests. Technically, two of them anyway are what we would refer to as an inventory, where you present the person with a paper and pencil list of statements, and they say if it applies to them or not. They say if it's true for them or not. If it is extremely true, if it's somewhat true, false, or very false. So two of the tests that I gave were these personality and psychiatric symptoms as a way to gather this information from him and then compare it to large groups of people of his age and education to get to a quantified view of what he's saying he's like and what's wrong with him, etc. The other test I gave was one that I would read the questions with some follow-ups to see how he answered those, and then compare those answers to large groups of people.
And are these tools that forensic psychologists typically use?
Yes, we do, and in forensic evaluations especially, they're very helpful because they can give us information about the defendant's, what we would refer to as their response style. Are they trying to look much better than they are? Are they, in a sense, putting forth their best foot? Are they being accurate in their endorsement of these items? Or are they engaging in what we call false impression management, which means, are they exaggerating problems? Are they endorsing problems that there's no other evidence for, to try to look bad, to try to look more ill than they are, to try to look more psychologically abnormal than large groups of people who are known to be disordered don't endorse symptoms that much.
And so the first of those tests, I'm going to start with the Personality Assessment Inventory, or the PAI.
Yes,
And did you perform that test on Mr. Lott?
I did.
And what were your findings?
Well, the most important finding on the personality assessment inventory is that it suggested that he tended to portray himself in an especially negative or pathological manner. In other words, he was exaggerating what he thought was the matter with him. And it actually makes the rest of the results very, you have to be very skeptical of those. So that was the major finding of the PAI.
And Doctor, based upon your experience and training, what does that indicate to you, if anything, given the charges and the plea?
That you have to be careful in relying too heavily on his self-report, on what he says.
And as a forensic psychologist, do you rely more heavily and find it more reliable a person's behavior or their self-reporting?
We always, in doing forensic evaluations, want to rely more on what people actually do, what other people have observed them doing, what there's a record of their behavior, rather than their self-report, especially by the time it comes closer to trial and they become perhaps aware of, at some point, a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. So behavior is considered to be the kind of data that more weight is put on in a forensic evaluation than self-report.
And having said that, does the defendant's appearance today in court, as you've identified him, does he appear any differently than when you saw him at the Wichita County Jail when you interviewed him in office?
Well, his hair is longer, his beard is longer. He looks thinner than he was even, that was only, what, a month ago? Other than that, he looks very similar.
And then you also saw him when he gave a statement?
Yes.
Had shoulder-length hair and no facial hair or razor stubble maybe. Is there any significance to that?
Possibly. That one of the things, and you heard this explained by Dr. Falls, that observance of appearance and hygiene can be important, that it can mean more mental disorder, but it also, a lot of times, is just related to being in jail. I mean, that's just, so it can be of significance, though.
And then, did you also perform the structured inventory for malingering symptoms, which is also referred to as SIMS test?
I did.
And what, if anything, was your opinion with regard to the results of that test?
When it came to symptoms of psychosis, neurological impairment, affective disorders such as depression, amnestic disorders across the board, he grossly exaggerated his symptoms on this test, and that score was close to twice the cutoff that you would need to be suspicious of somebody faking bad, at least for sure, symptom exaggeration, negative impression management.
In fact, on every raw score, he was higher than the cutoff for the score for probable malingering.
That's true.
Okay, and what is malingering?
That's when a person either totally fakes or grossly exaggerates mental illness for some external incentive. It can be in a court of law. It can be to try to get less punishment. It can be in an insanity case. It can be in a competency case. In other areas, in a civil case where somebody's suing somebody else, the external incentive can be to get money. It can be people can exaggerate or fake a disorder for other people paying them attention. That's another external incentive.
And doctor, the cutoff for these specific categories, such as neurological, the cutoff was 2. So anything greater than 2 indicates malingering, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And so his raw score was a 5.
Yes.
And then for affective disorder, the cutoff was 5, and his score was 7.
Yes.
And this is the interesting one for psychosis. And how do you define psychosis?
Well, again, as you heard a good description of it from Dr. Falls, that it's when somebody is not in touch with reality, that they have thoughts that are not in touch with reality. They may hear things that aren't there, see things not there. Their speech, their behavior can be what we call disorganized. It doesn't make sense or it's hard to follow. So all those things constitute a psychotic disorder.
And so under that category psychosis, the cutoff for probable malingering is 1.
Correct.
And the defendant's was an 8.
Yes.
So 8 times what the cutoff value was.
Correct.
With regard to low intelligence, the probable cutoff for malingering is 2,
Yes.
and the defendant's score was 4.
Correct.
And with regard to the probable score of malingering, as far as amnesia is concerned, was 2, and his score was 2.
Correct.
And so the total, the cutoff score for probable malingering for the test is 14, and the defendant's raw score was 26.
Yes.
It's almost twice.
Correct.
And did you also perform a test on Kody Lott, the Miller Forensic Assessment of Symptoms,
I did.
also referred to as the MFAST?
Correct.
And what were the results of that test?
It's the one that I asked the questions out loud, and all the questions on that instrument pertain to either exaggerating the symptoms of psychosis or faking a psychosis. His score on that was a 6, which is right at the cutoff. The cutoff is at 6 is the cutoff, and that's what he scored.
And did the defendant give you, I'm going to go back to your page 8 of your report regarding, did he give you a substance abuse history?
He did.
And what was that history?
Well, again, as you've heard, a pretty extensive history of substance abuse, with the exception of alcohol. He described it to me, he wasn't a big fan of alcohol. He does not have a family history that he knows of either drug or alcohol problems. But he has an extensive history since the age of 13.
And did he have any type of mental health history in his family?
He told me that his maternal grandfather was diagnosed with bipolar disorder.
And anything in his medical history that caused you concern or that of significance?
No, I did inquire. He told me that at at 13 he had an accident on a bicycle where he hit his head. He was taken to the hospital, evaluated. They determined that he had a concussion, and he was released.
Did he give you any employment history?
He did.
And was he ever able to hold down a steady job?
It was very limited. 2 jobs, one at Sonic, where he told me that he worked for a year, and the other one was at Chipotle, where he worked for 2 months before he walked off the job one day.
Just walked off and never went back?
Right.
And then, as far as a diagnostic formulation, did you have one in this case?
Yes.
And what was your formulation for your conclusion?
Well, I will preface that with saying it was difficult. That to arrive at specifically what is wrong with him is difficult, was difficult for me, for a lot of reasons. He does have a previous diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder, one of which was before this offense. It did follow an attempt to get him into drug treatment, where he did not stay at the drug treatment. He absconded from that very quickly, and then he was placed in the Harris County Psychiatric Center, where he stayed for approximately 60 days, and he was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder. As I've said before, he has a history of drug and substance abuse that's almost always difficult to disentangle between a mental disorder that's not drug related.
Doctor, on that, can you take drugs and then cause mental damage to yourself or a physical damage to your brain as a result of taking those drugs?
Sure.
And so in some instances, your drug usage, can it cause your mental illness or your physical difficulty in your thought process or your actions? Or?
Sure. If you take the right kind of drugs in large amounts for a long time period, it can cause you to have brain damage that can end up in changes in your behavior and the way you think, the way you can regulate your behavior, what the person is like. And that's, it also, of course, can change somebody's behavior, emotions, and thinking, even if it's not taken over a long time period, but if a lot is taken at one time for some time period following that, it can result in a disorder that if the person doing the diagnosing doesn't know that it's drug-related, it can be thought that it's not due to the drugs. I think the clearest cut example that I see frequently is some person high on methamphetamines where they get manicky, and they then are seen by some mental health professional, and they are said to be bipolar.
And what is manic?
Talk real fast, change topics, real tangential thinking. That talking real fast, we call it pressured speech. Being wired, being hyperactive, not needing much sleep, doing things that are exciting to them, not thinking about the consequences. So that's a manic episode.
And doctor, in all the things that you've reviewed, the documents, the evidence, and talking to the defendant, do you have any indication that the illicit drug ingestion by this defendant over the years was anything but voluntary?
I do not have anything other than it was voluntary.
And if you have a mental illness, can illicit drugs exacerbate your symptoms or your thinking or your actions?
Yes, that's one of the reasons that, like I said, it's difficult to disentangle what's caused by drugs and what's caused by something else.
And then back to your diagnostic formulation, I believe I cut you off. I
Okay.
apologize.
Well, there's also his exaggeration of symptoms at this time is another complication. But I don't have a lot of disagreement with the diagnostic formulation presented to you yesterday by Dr. Falls. We know that there's a group of disorders that are the schizophrenic disorders that have these psychotic symptoms that we've been talking about. The defendant has been previously diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, which is in that group, which means there's some psychotic symptoms and there's some affective or emotional ones, depression or a history of manic episodes. I think that is a diagnosis here. It could possibly have been at play at the time of the offense. It appears to be at this time controlled by psychiatric medications. So that I would agree with Dr. Falls. When you heard him talk about, this has been going on a long time with what he called prodromal syndrome, or prodromal symptoms, I'm sorry, that are looking back on it when somebody has a schizophrenic break in their late teens, early 20s, family will sometimes say, well, you know, he always was a little odd. There was something off, or he was isolated, he didn't have friends. Hindsight, they can look back and see, and oftentimes those were what we call prodromal symptoms. Prodromal symptoms, excuse me. There's another explanation for those, and I think it's at play here, and it's a personality disorder. We have two big categories of what's wrong with people in psychology and psychiatry. Mental disorders, most common is depression. They often say that's the common cold of psychiatry. Anxiety, but also these serious ones, these severe ones in the form of psychotic disorders. Those are mental disorders, mental illness, if you will. But people also can have a personality disorder. They're not sick, it's just the way they are. They usually have symptoms that we might all have sometimes, but with them it's more intense, and it interferes with their life. They may not be as distressed about their personality as other people are about their personality. So it causes other people problems as well. The easiest example I could give is we are all dependent at times on somebody for something. That is a common human trait. But there is a dependent personality disorder where they are so needy and so dependent on others they can't function in society well, and they're distressed by it. They can't make a decision at the grocery store about what kind of canned tomatoes to buy, and they have to call somebody. That's a dependent. So it's a common trait that's very severe in a person. There is a personality disorder called a schizotypal personality disorder. It's called that because it's, in this family of schizophrenic disorders, but it's not that the person's going along fine in life and they get sick with schizophrenia, but it's just the way they are. A schizotypal personality disorder includes odd behaviors, fascination with the occult, with the supernatural, with magical thinking of some type, with being very uncomfortable around other people, and hence they're isolated, and they may talk about really strange sounding things with anybody at any time. So it looks a little like schizophrenia or a psychotic disorder, but it's just the way they are. What we know is somebody that has a schizotypal disorder is also vulnerable to developing a full-blown schizophrenic disorder, is also more vulnerable to the effects of drugs on their behavior, thinking, and emotions. And so my opinion is that that's one of the problems here in this case is that Mr. Lott has a schizotypal personality disorder. He also, of course, has the rather severe drug abuse, especially with cannabis and opioids, and that those two drugs, especially cannabis today, it's not the cannabis of the 1960s and 70s. It's much stronger. And including, we have what we call a synthetic cannabis, or K2 is one of those. Very strong. Those drugs can cause somebody to have a psychotic episode that mostly we think of that if they stop using, that should clear in 30 days. But there are cases where it doesn't. There are cases that it lasts for 60 days, a year, and for some, there's some symptoms, depending on how extensive their cannabis abuse has been over a long time period, some of those problems can be permanent. And in my opinion, I think with the cannabis and opioids that Mr. Lott had been taking and took on September the 2nd of 2016 played a role in this offense and caused him impairment in his thinking, his behavior, his emotions.
Do you believe, in your professional opinion, had he not been using marijuana or opioids, that he would have committed the offense?
I don't know.
And so you said that psychosis, which we talked about earlier, can be caused by the drug usage?
Yes, it can be.
So they can bring that on if you're vulnerable to psychosis?
Yes.
And then if you have that personality disorder and you surround yourself with individuals that enable you to, for example, a mother, and your mother enables that neediness and provides you with what you want, can it affect your personality disorder?
Yes, it can.
And based upon the information that you've obtained in this case, is it possible that Kody Lott's mother, Christy Rowland, was part of his vulnerability and fed his personality disorder?
Based on the information I have, I think that's is likely.
And in fact, did she know about his drug usage?
Yes.
And did she also provide him with money to buy his illicit drugs?
I don't think that she wanted him to use the money that she gave him for drugs. Instead, it was for his needs, other needs.
But she knew that he was a frequent user of illicit drugs,
Yes,
that he had a problem.
that's my understanding,
And
yes.
she even drove him to Centacor, which was the drug treatment facility that he left in the middle of the admissions process.
Yes,
And then she also provided him with money from time to time, even hid it around the house so as not to, our apartment, so as not to disclose the full amount, so he wouldn't chew it up with illicit drugs all in one day. Is that correct?
that's apparently the reason. I can't come up with any other reason for her to stash money that she was going to give to him in different places in the house so that he'd have to call her to get it.
And then she also knew that he didn't work or have any type of other source of income, correct?
That's correct.
And did you speak to her, did you have an opportunity to speak to her about her son, Kody Lott?
I did not.
And did you have an opportunity to speak to his father, biological father, David Lott, about his son, Kody Lott?
I did not.
And based upon the information you were provided, did they ever indicate in any statement or to police or otherwise that their son, Kody Lott, had been interested in the occult or Satan?
I don't recall any statements they made, but my understanding is they were aware of his fascination with that.
And this jury knows that the defendant and saw the video of the initial stop of the defendant 2 days after the offense was committed. And they got to hear the video where the defendant is communicating with the officers, answering questions, and makes no reference to the devil or any type of delusion.
Correct.
And then the same thing with regard, they watched yesterday, the defendant's statement to detectives on that Sunday, September 4th of 2016.
Yes.
And for the first approximately, I want to say 45 minutes of that statement, there was no reference to Satan or the devil, or he didn't appear to be under any delusion.
I would agree with that.
And is that significant to you at all, that he can hold it together and not mention anything about the devil or delusions, and can lie quite easily to officers for about 45 minutes?
Is that of significance to me? Yes, it is.
And what is the significance?
Well, while people with a severe mental disease or disorder, their behavior can vary from day to day, just like anybody else's. It's typically not under their voluntary control, and they don't usually want to be that way. They can't voluntarily turn it on or off. With a person who's talking about delusions or false beliefs or odd things that we know that couldn't be true. They can keep from talking about it sometimes if they think for some reason they can, but it's difficult. And when they get an opportunity and a person is a sympathetic ear, then it's difficult to stop them. And you certainly can't talk them out of it usually. You can't say, now you know there's no such thing as that. There's no evidence of that. And they go, well, then they usually turn that around and you're part of the delusion then, and or you don't understand.
And so, in those two instances, did you find the defendant, in your professional opinion, to be suffering from any sort of delusion during the traffic stop or the initial 45 minutes of the defendant's statement to detectives?
I did not see any behavior that was evidence of a delusion at those times.
And that's something that you want to look at because it's approximately 48 hours after the offense that he committed of murder and aggravated assault.
It's more important than how that person is acting 2 years later.
Because you want to look at the time of the event or contemporaneous to the event. That's the most important time, is it not?
Correct. In an insanity evaluation, for sure.
And also, when the defendant is finally booked into jail, he makes his first telephone call, which I believe you've listened to or read the transcript of. He talks to his mother and his stepdad, and when they ask why he did it, which is the murder and aggravated assault of two 13-year-olds, he didn't say the devil made me do it, did he?
No.
Didn't say he was hearing voices that told him to kill, did he?
No.
And is it common for a adult child, when they're caught in by their parents of why did you do something, it's common for them to say, I don't know, isn't it?
That's my experience.
And then you had an occasion to speak to the defendant about his version of the crime, did you not?
Yes.
And what did he tell you?
Well, what I do usually is ask about what was going on in their life in the time period right before the offense, to see what their state of mind was then. And he described to me that his state of mind in that time period before the offense was a very stressful time in his life. He couldn't stop using drugs. He didn't want to go to psychiatric treatment or any kind of treatment. One of the reasons he gave is that he was afraid of blood draws, of them taking blood from him. And with regard to any drug treatment, he didn't want that because he did not want to stop using. He was on community supervision and having problems with that. He thought that he was not going to be successful at that because of drugs. And of course they do random urinalysis, and he just knew that he wasn't going to be able to stop. So he was under a lot of stress, and his supply of both cash and drugs was not as consistent as he would have liked.
Doctor, those are all his choices to make, are they not?
Well, yes. We think of our behavior when it comes to adherence to treatment and the commission of offenses being at least largely a decision on the part of the person. It can be an impulsive one, but it is voluntary.
And did he tell you about his obsession with Satan and Satanism?
He did. He told me that he spent a lot of time doing research on Satanism. He particularly cases involving a Satanist that committed an offense, especially that committed the offense of murder. And he did, though, tell me that he was only obsessed with Satanism when he was high on drugs. It was not some lifelong hobby or interest of his, but it was associated with drug abuse. And then I asked him to tell me what happened. He told me and gave me a coherent story, logical in that it went from point A to point B to the end, that of what happened on that day.
And what did he tell you happened on that day?
Well, a lot of this is consistent with what you've heard, that he told me he did not know the victim. He didn't know her name. He thought she was at least 16. He was surprised when, after the offense, he found out that she was only 13.
Okay, let me stop you there, doctor. But in his statement, he admits that he knew they were walking home from middle school and that they were extremely young.
Yes.
I'm sorry, continue.
He described her, and this is consistent with other statements he's given, as being very attractive, beautiful, he thought, and he would observe her on frequent occasions right behind his mother's apartment, and he said that he saw her at least 5 to 10 times walking home from school. He told me this was planned, that it was not an impulsive offense, that he planned it and thought about it for at least 2 months. And again, he was really concerned about his legal status at the time and thought he was going to go to prison, and said that he thought if he's going to go to prison, he might as well go to prison for something that was worth it. And that was a part of the motivation for this offense. He thought the offense, what he was going to do, would somehow magically solve all of his problems. And while he didn't say this, a lot of his problems had to do with being independent, have money, not being able to stop using drugs, causing his family trouble with regard to those things. And the prison seemed like an alternative to that. So his parents were out of town on a vacation. He had a key to the house. He told me, this is all what he told me. He got the gun out of the safe. He got the gun in anticipation of something that was going to happen. He knew she had a boyfriend because he saw them together. He put the gun in a bag of some sort and put it in his Tahoe and took it to, as he said, unload on them. He had a choice of guns, as you've heard, either the .223 or the .22. He didn't take the .223 because he didn't want to cause any more physical damage than he had to, and he knew that his father really liked that 23 and he didn't want it to be taken from him, and that he took the gun and that planned this because, as he said, I didn't want a witness or anything. He left a note for his mother and stepfather. He did not want to get caught. Part of the plan was an escape route on a country road that was not traveled frequently. He was going to go afterwards as a part of the plan to this friend's house in Albany for more drugs. He had previously bought a police scanner app on his phone so that he could follow what the police activity was afterwards. He told me that he was intoxicated on drugs on the day of the offense. He told me something different than he told to Dr. Falls. He told me that he took approximately 8 to 12 hydrocodone on that day and smoked all of the marijuana he could that he thought could have been laced with something, either PCP or embalming fluid. And that's one thing that is sometimes done, that they would soak the cannabis in embalming fluid. So he told me that he was intoxicated. I did hear, and it made sense to me from Dr. Falls, that his tolerance for drugs was much higher than most people because he did so much drugs for so long. But based on what he told me, he was intoxicated on that day.
And so with somebody that has a high tolerance that takes that amount of hydrocodone, they can still function, can they not?
Yes. I don't know what the limit is. I mean, you could take, obviously, so much opioids that you could kill yourself. It happens,
Right.
as we know. But people with tolerance can take large amounts and still function.
And so he could still function to get the guns out of the gun out of the gun safe with a key and a screwdriver, and then he can still function to know to rack the weapon and put it on safety. And then he can function so well that he waits and is patient for the victims to be walking by home from school at 3 o'clock or 3:15. And he can still function to operate a motor vehicle to get to the alley, which is approximately a block away, and take a left turn. And then he has the ability to function enough to pull the trigger several times of that semi-automatic weapon and aim it at two 13-year-olds. And then he's certainly able to function enough to play it cool and get to the back roads and throw the weapon into a vacant field where there's high grass so it was to be not found. And then he is tolerant enough of those drugs to make it to Albany, Texas, correct?
All that he told me that he could do, and he did. That's what he told me. He did say, though, that he was intoxicated, that he was feeling no pain and on top of the world, but he could act normal. That's what he told me. So he went on to describe the offense itself. The target, he said, was Lauren. You've heard this. The other girl, Michaela, was there, and as he told me, in the wrong place at the wrong time, and she started to run, is what he told me, so he shot her. But the Lauren was screaming, so he shot her from, as he said, from the lower part to the top part, meaning up the body. He told me that he didn't kill Michaela because he didn't have enough ammunition. He took the planned escape route.
And let me stop you there, Doctor. He told you that he didn't kill Michaela because he didn't have enough ammo?
Correct.
Did he tell you why he would have killed
He didn't want to witness.
And then did he also say that he didn't touch Lauren?
He did.
And did you ask him that question? Because one of the things you're looking for, I would assume, in a person that is claiming that the devil told them to do it, or they're interested in satanical or theories or the occult, is rituals.
Correct.
And what are some of the rituals a person that is truly interested in responding to delusions of such?
Well, they can be very strange and very bizarre, and it can involve taking a body part, or I was on a case here in Fort Worth where the person drew with a razor blade a pentagram on the back of the person. Not drew, cut a pentagram with an X-Acto knife. So some bizarre part of all this that relates to the occult. And he didn't do that. He didn't, also didn't leave any fingerprints or evidence at the scene that would tie him to that. He did, it was pointed out in testimony, he didn't clean the grass off of the rifle. He put it back in the safe with that on it. At the time I talked to him, had not thought of that. So he took the planned escape route. He threw the gun out the window into the grass. He listened to the police scanner. He got more drugs. He got some Lortab and Xanax and took them and relaxed. Went back to the apartment, watched the news, looked at Facebook. His computer log evidence indicates that he was following the news on Facebook and other sites, as I recall from looking at that, quite frequently. He learned from that, as you've heard again, that they were looking for a black truck, and they didn't have a description of the person. He began to believe that he wasn't going to get caught. He went back twice to find the gun because he'd taken that from, that's what he told me, he'd taken that from his parents' safe. If it was gone, they would put two and two together that was likely involved in it, and that he also said that somebody might find it, and so it was thrown out of the car to conceal the evidence, and then it was retrieved and put back in the safe to conceal evidence. He destroyed the note that he left for his mother and stepfather, and then you know that he was later a lead. On the basis of the lead, he was interviewed by the police on September the 4th, if you saw that interview, in the beginning, he lied. He told me that he lied because he was trying to get away with the crime. But when they told him that they knew he was on the street that day, he said, "I knew they had me." And so that's when he said it came clean. So that's the version that he gave me that is, I think, consistent with other evidence that we've seen.
And so he is telling you all of that 2 years later, and it's still consistent with what he said 2 years earlier to the detectives that day, is it not?
It is consistent both in content and also the way that he talks about it. Like I said, in the tape you saw, while he's talking about that, he's really kind of excited about it, smiling, laughing at least during the time with Detective Casillas, and he does that with me when he's describing this without showing any significant remorse other than he would have liked to have not gotten caught. So he feels bad that he got caught,
Not that he did it.
not that he did it.
And finally, Doctor, what it all comes down to is, did the defendant appreciate the wrongfulness of his actions?
That's an important part of an insanity evaluation, and my opinion is, and as a lot of what you've seen already, that the behavioral evidence at the time of the offense, prior to it with the planning, the offense itself, and his behavior after the offense is consistent with him knowing that his behavior was wrong, that it was against the law, that it was a crime, that it was illegal.
And even the defense expert agreed and had 46, I believe, items that he listed that the defendant appreciated the wrongfulness of his actions.
Correct. I think I've done, I know that I've testified in about 25 or so insanity cases. The majority of those that I do don't go to court. I mean, something else happens in the case. So it's probably close to 100 of these I've done. I can't recall an insanity case that I've been involved in that had as many signs that the defendant knew his conduct was wrong.
And are you aware of the defendant having a telephone call with his mother approximately 2 weeks after he'd been arrested, in which he and his mother discussed pleading not guilty by reason of insanity?
I am aware that it was about 14 days later, on the 16th of September, they had that discussion in which, on that telephone call, he told his mother that that was the plan, that he was going to plead not guilty by reason of insanity.
That's a witness.
Mr. Rasmussen?
Doctor, let's start out, good to see you again this morning.
Good to see you too.
Let's start out first of all with, we've got a lot of agreement on things in this case also, don't we?
Yes.
Okay. Schizoaffective disorder is a major psychotic illness, correct?
Correct.
And it would qualify in an insanity evaluation as the severe mental disease and defect that would give rise to a finding of insanity.
I think in most cases it would, yes.
And your conclusions, you have a chance on page 15.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, and there's three major paragraphs there. The first paragraph, you provide an indication of that possibility, is that right?
That's correct. I think with his history of having been previously diagnosed as schizoaffective disorder, even though it was close to a time of, heavy drug abuse, that was there after his arrest and incarceration. He definitely showed signs of a schizoaffective disorder, I believe a year after the offense, and he was treated for that. So I think that it was likely part of his mental state at the time of the offense.
And you're on the outpost.
Yes, sir.
Doctor, I'm going to show you what's been marked as Defendant's Exhibit 2 and represent to you, I believe these are records that you've reviewed, but I want you to go ahead and take, I don't want you, there's a lot of them. I'm not going to ask you to go through all of them, and I don't think the jury would want that, but just to make sure that these are records that you've had access to.
Yes, these, I recognize the cover page. These are the records from the UT Harris County Psychiatric Center. They don't, unfortunately, have these stamped for the number of pages here, and I didn't bother to count them. You can see they're extensive.
Right. And they may have them though. Down here some, but they've got additional pages.
There
I
are,
think.
but there's at least 570 pages of text, and then there's test results. It looks like, gosh, well, here's another set of test results and all this that it's probably another 100 pages or so.
And you can go ahead.
Okay.
What type of records are included in that stack? In other words, are those records that psychiatrists made notes and reports in there?
Yes, it's the treatment notes from the psychiatrist and psychologist there, from social workers, psychiatric nurses, mental health workers, or we used to refer to them as psychiatric aides. So all this are those people's observations and documentation of what they did to treat him for the problems he was having that they diagnosed as schizoaffective disorder.
And in that stack is also, that's a record of his behavior at the hospital, correct?
The observations of his behavior by all those professionals, yes.
And that happened at least a year before this shooting.
Approximately a year before the offense.
And in addition to, I'm going back here to your conclusions and opinions. Of course, you mentioned the substance-induced psychosis, which is what your opinion is at this time, is that right?
Yes.
But you also indicate that ultimately multiple stressors led to his decompensation into a full-blown schizoaffective disorder. And then I believe you go to describe that, which is a combination of symptoms of schizophrenia and depression. And I won't go into the rest, but is that your finding?
Yes.
And so is he suffering now? I'm separating a little bit from insanity. Is he qualified for schizoaffective disorder at this time?
Well, the diagnosis at this time would be that, like many disorders and diseases, some of which are physical that some of us have, we don't talk about cure too much. We talk about management of the symptoms. And at the time I saw him, and I assume now, with the psychiatric medications that he is receiving and the abstinence from drugs that is achieved through a controlled environment, he's managed, but we would still say that the disorder is there in remission secondary to psychiatric treatment, and including, of course, the controlled environment.
So for treatment purposes, regardless of what determination courts may make, he will need to be treated probably for schizoaffective disorder for the rest of his life.
That would be my opinion, yes.
you say multiple stressors led to decompensation, I think are you talking about stressors in life that would cause him to decompensate?
At that time, what I'm referring to is he was incarcerated by that time for approximately a year and in solitary confinement, as far as I know, for the entire time, with little to no contact with family or support from anybody. And that situation can be stressful, and it can trigger an episode of a psychotic disorder of some type.
And we don't know a lot about the long-term effects of somebody's incarceration. I know there's some studies done, but that's a little bit difficult to call in situations.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of studies, and that, that some show that it's so stressful for some people that it leads to episodes of psychosis. Some studies show that it's the best a person ever does in their life. We call it a highly structured environment where they don't have to make decisions about what they do every day. Those are made for them. And I've seen inmates that have graduated from college that, while incarcerated, that didn't have a high school diploma prior to that, but they are able to function in that highly controlled.
They don't have drugs, too.
And there's, I say that, and inmates have told me they can get anything they want, and I know from looking at files from prisons, there are some drugs available, but it is not like the free world. I always ask them, I said, so you're telling me if I gave you 20 minutes and some kind of currency substitute, you could bring back anything I wanted? And, it's just...
But that's speculation.
It is. And I know it's possible, but it's unlikely. It's certainly not. The availability, accessibility of drugs is nothing like the free world.
Now, in your second paragraph there, this is where we discuss what you talked about, the evidence of knowledge of wrongfulness. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. I'm sorry.
And you've indicated, I guess, rather six numbers or bullet points. One, efforts to avoid detection is an indication of wrongfulness.
Right. Yes.
So if there was a lack of effort to avoid detection, would that be a sign that there would not be wrongfulness possible?
Possibly. I have seen insanity cases where the defendant didn't leave the scene and eagerly awaits the arrival of the police to tell them what happened. And, so...
That's where a person who is insane.
Yes, correct.
Okay.
Correct.
I guess what I'm asking you is these, okay, you've got, let's go ahead and list them. Is it number one, making efforts to avoid detection, correct?
Yes,
Number two, maintaining secrecy about the offense, correct?
correct.
Number three, disposing and manipulating evidence, correct?
Yes,
Number four, avoiding apprehension.
yes,
Number five, attempting to avoid being arrested and charged with the offense by lying to the police.
yes,
And number six, leaving communication to parents before the offense in anticipation of being apprehended, but then later destroyed.
yes.
So my question is if there's evidence that contradicts these six things, that could be evidence that the person did not know what they were doing as well.
Yes, in almost every case, you can find some evidence for both, and that's where the weighing comes into play, yes.
And sometimes can the same fact be both?
I think it probably can be. I think it probably could be, yeah.
Did you observe any facts at all that indicated Mr. Lott did not know the wrongfulness of his conduct.
Well, there could be things that we don't know about. I can't think of a behavioral indicator that would suggest to me that he did not know it was wrong. Other than his self-report about this was in some way in league with the devil, and the self-report of those odd, distorted, unfounded beliefs that he had.
Did you see delusional indicators in the second half of the interview with the police?
Yes, I think in the second half of that interview that we saw yesterday, there were statements he made that had a delusional quality to them that were this, occult, odd, bizarre even beliefs intertwined with what, a distortion of his study of even Christianity and with philosophy. And so there were certainly some things that could be interpreted either way. He said, for instance, it was God that did this, and that one of the tenets of Christianity is thy will be done, and many people who are devout Christians would say that things happen, good things and bad things, because of God. So, but that was distorted in his interpretation of that.
And that's some indication of delusional thinking.
It at least has this bizarre, odd, distorted quality, yes.
One of the things, of course, we saw the 3 hours of his interview, confession. As I was listening to you, questioning with Ms. Shelton, that was what he told you was, as you indicated, very consistent with what we saw. Is that right?
It was consistent in terms of the facts and what he did to attempt to not get caught, etc. When I interviewed him about a month ago, there was very little said about the devil and Satanism. He talked more about the motivation for this kind of stemming from the jealousy, which was odd anyway. I mean, wasn't rational for him to have these feelings of jealousy for a 13-year-old that he didn't even know. But he was angry about his past experiences with girls, and he talked more about that than he did, and as he did in the interview too, for the first half, than he did about the devil and satanic cults.
He was on medication at the time you talked to him. Is that right?
Right. He was much more stable. Right.
Back closer to the time, there was more discussion about the devil. Is that what you're saying? Back to the police interview.
Yes, in that it was like when he found a sympathetic ear and somebody that the officer even appeared to act like he was enjoying the conversation. I mean, so it was a good audience for him to talk about these ideas and beliefs that he had.
Opened him up and got the report that we heard discussed. Is that right?
He kind of overdid it, but he did talk, to answer your question, he certainly did talk more about the devil and Satanism, etc., in the second half of that interview.
And to your knowledge, he wasn't on any medication at that point in time. Is that right?
He was
At the time.
At the time, yeah, he was not taking any psychiatric medication to control his symptoms. He was still under the influence of substance abuse, partly as we saw towards the end there, the withdrawal symptoms from opioids. Yeah.
And then the third part of your conclusion, that's just what you've already told us, that your conclusion that you believe the conduct was, that he knew the conduct was wrong.
Yes, sir.
You've indicated this was a difficult case.
Especially arriving at a precise diagnosis, yes. It wasn't difficult, in my opinion, to arrive at the opinion that he knew his conduct was wrong. It was in trying to ferret out the effects of drugs and the effects of a severe mental disease and defect.
Well, you have a mixture of different kinds of drugs also.
Correct.
And there's a combination effect that is difficult to determine, correct?
That's possible, yes.
And you're relying upon his self-reporting of that, correct? To a certain extent.
Yes, yes.
You didn't have any drug test or anything to know what he had in his system back in September, of course, not 2016.
No, I did not.
The documents that I've shown you, Defendant's Exhibit 2, are those the type of documents that you rely upon in doing these type of evaluations?
Yes.
They are at this time going to offer Defendant's Exhibit 2.
Defendant's Exhibit 2 is admitted.
That's what
Ms. Shelton.
Just a few, Your Honor. Dr. Price, you were in the courtroom when Dr. Falls testified yesterday, were you not?
Yes.
He had mentioned, would you agree with me that his opinion that the defendant didn't appreciate the wrongfulness of his actions was based, for the most part, on self-reporting on the part of the defendant, Kody Lott?
I remember him using also the behavioral signs, but he also included a lot about the self-report, especially concerning disordered thinking and the psychotic thinking.
And then so he said, he mentioned that it cancels them out. Do you know what that phrase meant?
I think so. The way I interpreted that was that Dr. Falls had did a very thorough job of outlining the factors that indicate that he knew it was wrong, and then he listed factors that would support that he didn't know it was wrong that pertain to the delusional thinking. And so he in essence said, in spite of all of the behaviors, the signs that indicate he knew it was wrong, he couldn't have known it was wrong because he was delusional.
Based upon your 35 years of experience, do you agree with that proposition?
I do not, and that's probably the major disagreement that I have with Dr. Falls.
And you do know this is the first time he ever testified regarding sanity, correct?
That's what I understand.
And you were stating earlier that he basically said that he knew he was going to prison, and so he wanted it to be worth it.
Right.
And so that's part of the motivation for killing Lauren Randall.
That's what he said, yes.
And so Could he have done that so it pretty much forces his hand to go to prison so he doesn't have to make the choice to stop drugs?
And other choices to make about living independently too.
And then is it common for some prisoners who are in prison and it's structured and they function relatively well,
Yes?
and then they go out into general population and they can't function because they don't have that structure, and so they commit a new offense, so they go back to where they can handle life?
Yes, it's, for many, it's easier in prison in solitary confinement because they don't have to deal with other inmates. Some like that better because they're afraid. Some in solitary confinement decompensate though. So it just depends on the individual.
And then the defendant, although he was discharged a year prior to the committing the murder and the aggravated assault, he was prescribed medication, was he not?
He was.
And did he, to your knowledge, comply and take that medication?
To my knowledge, he did not. He told me that he was not compliant with the psychiatric medication.
Instead, he made a choice to continue his voluntary use of illicit drugs
Correct.
up into and through the time of his arrest.
Yes.
And did he also, when he was researching things, did he tell you that he researched certain killers?
Yes.
And do you remember some of those killers?
Well, he mentioned Charles Manson, and he mentioned also a case that I hadn't heard about. The guy's name was Ricky Casso, who murdered a friend of his in some type of satanic ritual while using drugs.
And then, did he tell you that he missed the drugs?
He did.
Did he tell you that if he were released from jail or prison that he would do drugs again?
He did.
And then, finally, you mentioned that the behavior indicators are more important than the self-reporting indicators.
That's correct.
And in your 35 years of experience, you have never had a case where you've had so many behavioral indicators that show that a defendant understood the wrongfulness of his acts.
That's correct.
That's the witness.
Doctor, you indicated that Kody Lott felt that this action, this conduct would magically solve his problems.
Yes.
That's what it is.
Dr. Falls did not conduct any tests, did he?
No.
And then you conducted tests, and why did you conduct those tests?
Well, to help obtain information about his current mental state, to see if it was consistent with what I could find out about his state of mind at the time of the offense, and also to evaluate the response style to see if there was a tendency to either engage in positive impression management or negative impression management, which is exaggeration of problems, which is what I found.
And so when you interviewed the defendant, the trial had been set, had it not?
Yes.
And it was coming up pretty fast, was it not?
About a month.
And you knew, because the defense had already filed a motion to plead not guilty by reason of insanity.
Yes, that's the reason that I was retained.
And so is that important for you when you saw that the defendant was malingering or exaggerating his symptoms?
Yes.
And why is that?
Well, I had to be more focused on facts, information in the records, information about what he did, than necessarily what he told me, because he was likely telling me things that were exaggerations of the problems that I believed that he had. But it made it more difficult for me to do the diagnostic work here.
So he was basically hoping that he could fool you.
Well, I would say at least influencing what I might have to say,
But it did not.
not in the direction that I believe he probably would have liked for it to go.
That's the witness.
Doctor, bottom line, there was a severe mental disease or defect, correct?
Correct.
We're talking about just about the wrongfulness here, is that right?
I think that's the
Bottom line.
that's where the rubber meets the road here.
Defendant's Exhibit 2, which is the records of the behavior of a year before, were not under the influence of any, as far as we know, any offense or any crime that had been committed right about the shooting of girls, correct?
That had been, well, not,
This case didn't occur at the time that he was in the hospital that generated defendant's Exhibit 2.
right, as to whether or not there were any other legal context, I'd have to
Well,
look at the
there's no
records again.
information of that at this point.
Right. Not that I can recall.
Okay, that's good.
Doctor, you relied upon those records in determining that the defendant was sane at the time of the offense. Did you not take that into account?
I did.
And prison, there's a high population in prison with defendants that are serving sentences that have mental illnesses, correct?
I'm going to object, that's speculation.
Sustained.
You've dealt with inmates in prison that have had mental illnesses, have you not?
Yes.
Pass the witness.
No further.
Thank you, doctor. You may step down.
You're on with the statement of rest. On the roll.
Council, approach the bench, please.
You want this on?
Kill the media mics that are near the bench.